Redditors with an ex who threatened to kill themselves over a breakup, how did that turn out? Story 1. Was with a girl once, and we were on the rocks for a while, break up then get back together and it got quite toxic. So one day I decided that was it and called it quits. I used to work retail and she knew my shifts and she popped up to my work to buy essential even though my workplace was 20 minutes further from her closet shops. I served her politely then kept it civil, which for her was a shock as I would usually give in and we would confess our love and get back together. So once that happened, she left the store and back then we weren't allowed mobile phone on shift, so she blew up my phone, messages and calls and saying stuff like how I embarrassed her etc. I got off the shift and looked at my phone and ignored her messages and a couple of hours later when I was home finally decided to pick up one of her calls to tell her to leave me alone. She told me she was in hospital and she attempted to take her life. I was shocked and asked which hospital and if I could come. She said no. I kept pressing for details and she would avoid and try to getting back together. I was like 90% sure she was faking it. I told her I would be there for her as a friend but I won't be getting back with her for the sake of my health and sanity. I hung up on her and called her friends and told them what had happened. They were shocked and started calling her etc. The next day I got confirmation that she had faked it all and that was the moment I knew I made the right choice. Story 2. My sister's ex-BF tried to kill himself by swallowing pills. It was vitamin C. Sad guy but great skin. Story 3. Back in the 90s. Broke up with her for a lot of reasons. She had lied to me about a lot of things, manipulated, got caught, crossed lines I told her not to cross so I told her we were over. I was 18. She was 23. She threatened to kill herself. Neighbor found her in her garage sitting in a car that was running. Got a call, got there as the ambulance was pulling up. Went to the hospital, she was going to be fine. Her family treated me like I was the one at fault. I told her goodbye, told her she needed to get help, and left. Never saw her again. Got a letter like 6 months later, but I just threw it away. This was about 6 months after my dad had killed himself because he found out he had terminal colon cancer, got drunk, he was an alcoholic, gambling addict, ruined his life, and shot himself using the pistol my mom bought him for Christmas a few years earlier. He was a cop. So I had no tolerance for this sort of emotional manipulation. She had her family, and I knew they would take care of her. Story 4. After he backed me into a corner with a big knife and threatened to stab himself to make me happy, then why was I the one in the corner, my dude? I videoed the rest of his destructive meltdown, punching walls, throwing dishes across the house, screaming threats at me, and sent it to my mom. Then I told him she had it and he was going to let me leave and sign the divorce papers, or she would send it to his chain of command and get him dishonorably discharged. Now that I know more about domestic violence, I do not recommend that direct kind of confrontation. I was very lucky it worked. Story 5. My ex would also threaten to stab himself to make me happy. Like because I wanted to break up with him, he took that to mean I wanted him dead. I called the police on him and it made him so angry that he started breaking my stuff. I called them again in fear of my life, and they never showed up. He broke so many things and put some holes in my walls, but it's been almost 4 months since the breakup and he is still alive. I lost all my confidence in the police though, because I called 911 twice and nobody even cared enough to show up. It could have ended much worse than it did. Story 7. I stayed somewhat firm but didn't kick her out immediately. After she realized it wasn't going to change my mind, she threatened again, and after a lot of things, having to hold her back, take all potentially dangerous objects away from her, break into my own bathroom to get the razors away from her, etc., she eventually ran to the balcony and pretended to choke herself unconscious. Thankfully my roommate picked up on this and how distraught and completely unable to process the situation I was at the time, and pulled me aside, said she was okay. Then told me to leave the apartment to go outside and call 911 for her. They showed up, immediately recognized she was taking and started barking orders at her, took her in, had her admitted with affidavits signed by my roommate and myself. She came back to the apartment after and only a few hours in, deciding to keep trying to make things happen with me. I had to continue to tell her no, and tell her parents to come get her so I wouldn't be forced to get law enforcement involved. They finally understood. A week or two before this I gave the same ultimatum and they told me to call the cops. I was pretty guilt-ridden about the whole thing. I hate seeing people hurting. She finally got picked up and left. I ignored all her calls and texts and then one day she managed to call me from some other phone, roughly a month or two after all this. She asked me how we're going to get through all this and the distance as a couple. I had to reiterate again we weren't together. Very clearly. For about a half hour. Like 6 years later she reached out to me and apologized and wanted to say she's sorry for everything and that she's finally received appropriate help and all that jazz. I forgave her, but haven't really talked to her at all since. She seems to be happily engaged to some other dude in another city now and Jay wish nothing but the best for her. Story 8. I had an ex that was schizophrenic who threatened suicide if I ever left her. When I left her, I did so by phone when she was staying down at her parents' house. While I hated to do it that way, that felt like the only way I could guarantee she wouldn't do anything, they'd watch her too close. Seems to have worked. Last I heard, she was happily married and had moved to California. However, there's a bit more to the story. That night, each of her parents called and left me an angry message. Her mom was understandably upset and tried to guilt me about it. Her dad on the other hand left me drunken death threats, saying things like, "You're a marked man," and "Count your lucky stars I haven't caught up to you yet." I took out a permanent restraining order after that. Related side note, did you know permanent restraining orders aren't actually permanent and can be overturned without the party who got the RO knowing about it? Another story for another time, I suppose. Story 9. Long story short. He had gotten into drugs really bad and when I finally had enough and told him it was over he told me he would live himself if I left. It took me a week after that to actually leave because every day he would tell me in a different way. I would hear things like "I love you too much to want you to be the one finding me." Or "I don't want you to have to see me do it because I love you." I would sit there and listen to him knowing I had to leave, that this scenario would play out the rest of my life if I didn't. One Friday I left for work with nothing but the clothes on my back and my wallet, still have the sweatshirt I was wearing that day. 2 weeks later he came to my work and stabbed me. If it wasn't for a co-worker I'd be dead. I shared this story on another post with the lead up to this moment so you can probably find that in my comment history.
Story 10. I was 18 and in an emotional, verbal, mentally abusive relationship. My ex would threaten suicide. We all knew he was only saying that to manipulate me every time I wanted to leave or didn't do what he wanted. I had enough one day and told him to go ahead to do it. He was obviously shocked cause I hung up and blocked him. His mom ended up calling me begging me to unblock him because he will do something bad. I told her it wasn't my problem and hung up and blocked her too. He ended up stalking me so I filed a restraining order against him. He always thought he had full control over me so he was definitely shocked when I cut him out the way I did. Story 11. My daughter dated a guy at the first part of this year. She didn't love him, but he was very much in love with her. They broke up and stayed friends. He would still come by her work and talk to her and spend a lot of time there, and she was nice and friendly to him, didn't rub it in his face when she started dating other people a month after they'd broken up, basically pretty good friends. One day, about a week before she graduated high school, he told her again that he loved her and was going to kill himself if she wouldn't be with him. She, and I'm proud of how she handled it like an adult despite being 18, told him that she cared for him and she'd always be there for him but she didn't want a relationship with him more than friends. She wasn't dating anyone else at the time, and she had to explain that just because she wasn't with anyone else, that doesn't mean she's needing a relationship so bad that she'll date him just to keep from being alone. She explained that would be leading him on, and she'd never want to do that. Well, he went home and killed himself. He left a note saying it's because she wouldn't be with him and he didn't want to live without her. Super small town in the rural South, so all of his friends and family blamed her. Detectives showed up at her school during exams and pulled her out to talk to her. She showed them all of their correspondence. They also said she'd been very adult and handled it in the best way she could have to be nice to the guy. One night, right after the graduation, we went to the local McDonald's. He had some friends that worked there and they kept giving her the stink eye, and she eventually went up to them and explained that she can't give her life for his and that she shouldn't be expected to be unhappy for anyone, and she showed them exactly what she'd texted and how she wasn't trying to hurt him, and after that they were all cool. It's really taken a toll on her. She still feels horrible about it and his mom still kinda makes offhand comments like it's her fault. She's handled it as good as I could have hoped anyone would have, but nobody should have to go through that, especially at her age. And that poor boy, thinking the only way out was to die over not being in a relationship with her. Sad all around.
Story 12. My ex was pretty unstable. When it was clear that our relationship was dying, she kept threatening suicide if I left her. The night I broke up with her, she grabbed my car keys and tried to run out the door, saying that she was going to drive my car off this big bridge down the road. I bear hug restrained her until I could grab the keys out of her hand. Once I let her go, she started hitting me and threw a glass lamp at my head. She just would not stop attacking me to get to my car keys. It devolved into me pinning her to the floor and just sort of laying on top of her while she punched, bit, and scratched me. I called 911. By the time the police arrived, she'd tired herself out and we were both covered in my blood. I was pretty sure I was about to be arrested for domestic violence, but thankfully she was stupid or unstable enough to tell them the truth, plus it helped that I was the only one with any injuries. I explained her suicide threats, they took her to the psych ward for 72 hours, and I spent the rest of the night cleaning blood out of the carpet. I packed my shit and disappeared by the time she got out. It was her name on the lease, so I just crashed with some friends until I could get my own place. The last time we spoke, she was mad at me for getting her sent to the hospital. In her words, I should have known she wasn't actually going to do it. Glad she could at least admit that it was all to manipulate me. Last I heard, she's still alive and crazy many years later. Story 13. When she threatened to kill herself, I called her bluff and called the cops. She wasn't serious about killing herself, but she still got sectioned. I've never seen her again after that day. Story 14. Well, we didn't break up, but she did actually kill herself. It sucks, we weren't even married yet. We just got name tattoos, I know, and she just kinda went paranoid for a few weeks, kept thinking I was unfaithful. I was never. They took her to the psych ward one night, she convinced them she was fine. They released her, she went home, left me a will, and a suicide note and killed herself. Story 15. We were 17 and 18. I considered a breakup when I realized that he had an ugly habit of threatening to hurt/harm himself if I potentially did something he didn't like, and that it would obviously, LOL, be my fault. But this quote of his is what made me turbo emergency exit instead of break up amicably. When you and I have a family with kids, and I ever get the feeling you might be cheating on me, I'll shoot the kids first, in front of you, so you will witness that, then I'll shoot you, and then myself. This was said within a lighthearted, what might our future together look like, way down the line, type of conversation. Story 16. I broke up with someone fairly amicably when I was 16 and he was 17, but I cut ties with him, the real breakup, a couple months later when I got therapy and refused to be his therapist anymore. He threatened to self-harm if I left him and told me it would be my fault, which immediately confirmed to me that I was doing the right thing. My self-harm issue was in full swing at the time, and he assumed that I couldn't handle the idea of causing someone else to self-harm. But I knew that it was ultimately my decision, and therefore it was also his decision, and I also didn't entirely believe him because he didn't have a history of self-harm prior to the falling out. What made it go from, "we can't be close friends," to, "I am never speaking to you again," was actually two separate quotes by him. I should have pushed you to suicide rather than talk you down from it, which whatever, but I still care about you. I'll tell you the day when you and your siblings need to stay home from school. Told the school counselor about all of it, but mostly that last part, because what the fuck. He stayed the rest of the semester and then dropped out. He had one semester to go before graduation. Story 17. I made a recording of the phone call. She was acting crazy for a while, thought it'd be a good idea, and then called the police as soon as she made that threat. Let professionals handle it. Story 18. First, are you okay? This sounds very specific. My ex killed himself 2 years after we stopped talking. In the end, I walked away when I realized I was unimportant in his story. He would self-harm or not completely independently of me, the only reason he wanted to keep me was for control. Story 19. I was very young and didn't realize I was being manipulated, or that breaking up was a unilateral decision and not a negotiation. I stayed for several more years and eventually he left me for someone else. Now, my response would be, go ahead and do it. It's not on me. Sounds harsh, but anyone that manipulative and revolting can fuck off all the way to hell. Story 20. Little bit of a backwards story. My ex was very manipulative. She faked a pregnancy. One night she called me and said she was going to kill herself by the train. I was still dealing with depression at the time from another event that transpired between us. I am a hopeless romantic and thought that if she was doing that, then I wanted to go with her. I downed 2 bottles of Tylenol. Problem was she never actually tried to commit suicide. Yup. Live and learn, I guess. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder a few months before this and have had up and downs for 20 years. Even though I'm an extremely sentimental man, after that happened, I became very guarded. Story 21. In this situation, I was /am the crazy ex. My wife and I were having marital issues, and we got into an argument one day and it evolved from the simple argument to the deeper problems in our marriage. My wife started talking about not being happy being with me and the probability of divorce. Noting that, I don't think of myself as a monster, I genuinely want only the best for my wife and her happiness. So I spiraled and my world came crashing in on me, I'm so devoted to her and I can't imagine my life not being with her. So I sent her my suicide note via text message. I grab my 9mm handgun and walk into the master bathroom. My wife received the text message and came rushing into the room and we fought over the bathroom door, me trying to close it and her trying to open it. She quit trying and the last thing I remember is holding the gun up to my chin and looking at my crying face in the mirror. Next thing I know I'm waking up in a hospital bed, 2 months later, missing my right eyeball, mouth numb, and just general confusion as to why I'm in the hospital. I felt like I just woke up from a nap or something. Doing what I did was, understandably, too much for my wife and she tells me that she doesn't love me as a spouse anymore and her intention to proceed with a divorce. It was the worst and stupidest decision I have ever made. It broke my wife mentally and she's still messed up over it 10 months later. That decision took my wife, took my eye, and took, so far, 10 months of my time for recovering from it. I'll spend the rest of my life regretting my decision and I'll forever feel guilt for what I did to my family.